Hello, welcome back to part 2 of lesson 8.14, in which we are studying and analyzing a society in transition. So for this portion of the video, we're going to be examining what caused an overall public decline in the confidence of the American government. So there's going to be a lot of reasons why the American public starts to lose faith in the efficacy of the federal government. But for this portion, again, we're going to be examining economic challenges, political scandals, and then foreign policy crises. So the first of these categories is economic issues. Again, overall, the American public felt as though that the federal government was not capable or was not willing to solve the issues in the economy during this time. So the first region we need to talk about is the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt is a name that is given to the heavily industrial states, which also happen to be highly unionized, surrounding the Great Lakes. So this is Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Many of these were blue-collar factory jobs, and many of these towns within these states saw massive unemployment as many of these factories start to permanently close. And so this highly industrialized area of the United States is going to start to stand in stark contrast to the Sun Belt. So the reason why the Rust Belt develops in the 1960s and the early 1970s occurs for a few reasons. One reason is that manufacturers are going to move industrial jobs to the south, into the Sun Belt, because many of these areas were not unionized. And so they could have cheaper labor. In addition, we saw a lot of industrial jobs being outsourced overseas in order into developing nations where, again, labor is going to be cheaper. And the third major reason why is because Americans are going to start to buy more fuel efficient and foreign vehicles during this time. So in this, post World War II era where people can get good, decent paying jobs within the factories and Ford's factories and whatnot in these areas, now all of these jobs are drying up. So as these good, decent paying industrial jobs dry up, people either move other places and find other opportunities. And this leaves many of these places in the upper Great Lakes region, again referred to as the Rust Belt, to experience high unemployment and also urban decay. The second main economic crisis that American public feels as though the federal government was not trying to address or trying to solve was the issue of stagflation. So as a result of a global economic recession related to the energy crisis, prices in the United States will increase significantly. So the price and the increase of consumer goods is what we call inflation, while wages, what people were making, will remain unchanged or stagnant. So this word is created out of those two economic phenomena going hand in hand, stagflation. And so what was happening then, workers were making the same amount of money, but could afford to buy less with their paychecks, since the overall prices of goods and items were increased. So people will look to the federal government for economic aid. We know this is not unusual, but Nixon is not going to provide any type of relief programs as the modern liberals would have. So in addition to the United States government under Nixon refusing to address these economic woes, we're also going to have several scandals within the executive branch that makes the American public lose faith in their government. So again, just to kind of take a step back and rewind, in the 1960s, the Vietnam War was highly televised. There was coverage on all three channels almost constantly, which made this what we refer to as a living room war. And so the fact that people were able to view the Vietnam War on TV, this is going to lead to a credibility gap in the fact that what LBJ and his administration was saying regarding the war in Vietnam and then what people were actually seeing about the war in Vietnam was very contradictory. So this disconnect between what people were seeing versus what their federal government was hearing actually came to like a concrete head with the issuance of the Pentagon Papers. And the Pentagon Papers were actually leaked to the Washington Post by a whistleblower, so somebody who was on the inside of the executive branch. So what the Washington Post does with the Pentagon Papers is they publish a series of articles that reveal deceptions made by the executive branch all the way from Eisenhower through Nixon regarding the war in Vietnam, including the fact that the executive branch thought that the war in Vietnam was unwinnable, despite the fact that they kept sending more and more U.S. troops and escalating U.S. involvement over there. So Nixon is going to try to stop the publication of the Pentagon Papers, but he is unable to. And so this just yet confirms the fears of many Americans, many younger Americans particularly, that the federal government cannot be trusted. And so the third major executive scandal that shakes the American public's confidence in their government is the Watergate scandal. So just a little bit of background on this. In 1972, there's going to be a burglary at the Democratic Party campaign headquarters in the Watergate office building. So the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate building is in Washington, D.C. This is an election year. And so when the burglars are caught, they actually give evidence linking involvement by staff members at Nixon's Oval Office. So Nixon ends up winning re-election in 1972, and a congressional investigation is opened up into the Watergate scandal. And through this congressional investigation, it was found, they were trying to determine whether or not Nixon was involved in attempts to cover up White House involvement in the Watergate scandal. It was alleged that Nixon had involvement with the Watergate break-in, again, because this happened at the Democratic headquarters. Nixon was a Republican. So the idea was that he had employed people to try to dig up some dirt, if you will, on his Democratic challenger. Nixon is going to refuse to cooperate with the investigation, and he tells the American public, "I am not a crook." But then after an additional investigation by the Washington Post, this will reveal that Nixon had taped conversations in the Oval Office, which could provide evidence proving guilt. And Nixon was going to be forced then to turn over the tapes. After Nixon is forced to turn over these Oval Office recordings that allegedly could prove guilt, he did turn over the tapes, but there's giant chunks that were missing out of that. So at that point, the House is going to start impeachment proceedings. So at this point, Nixon essentially says, "You can't fire me, I quit." And he decides to resign from office, making him still to this day the only president to resign from the position. So then when his vice president, Gerald Ford, becomes the president, he will pardon or ask for forgiveness for a crime. And he will pardon Nixon, essentially telling the American people that he wants to move past this long national nightmare of Watergate. So to pardon Nixon was to allow the American public to heal after this Watergate scandal, because now the American people don't have to deal with a lengthy criminal trial. And then so last but not least, we also had several elements of failing foreign policy during these decades that created a loss of confidence within the U.S. government. So just to rewind a little bit regarding the Vietnam War, the U.S. was involved heavily for over a decade. And then since we lost this war, this also created a loss of American prestige abroad, as well as declining morale back here at home. And so America abroad is not being perceived as big and bad as we once were. And so this is something that will end up leading into the Iranian hostage crisis. So to rewind for a minute, in 1979, the country of Iran undergoes its own civil war, its own revolution, where they overthrow the Shah, which was a monarch that the United States supported. We got along with the Shah. We felt as though the Shah supported American interests, especially when it came to our ability to obtain oil and to obtain oil cheaply. However, the Iranian people hated the Shah, so during the revolution, they exiled him, and the Shah came then to the United States. And in place of the Shah, the Iranian people put in charge the Ayatollah, who is going to be a more strict or fundamentalist Islamic leader. So a few months after this revolution, the United States Embassy in Iran is going to be overrun with Iranian students, and they will take the Americans who are there at the embassy hostage in an event that becomes known as the Iranian hostage crisis. And these students were actually supported by the government of Iran, and they are essentially demanding the return of the Shah, who again was living in exile in the United States and later would die in the United States from cancer. So these hostages are going to be held in the U.S. Embassy by these Iranian students, backed by the Iranian government, for 444 days, while President Jimmy Carter attempts to negotiate for their freedom. So this hostage crisis, as well as the energy crisis that precedes it, is going to greatly reduce President Carter's credibility with the American people. And in the end, this ends up costing him his bid for re-election for a second term. So even though he does not win a second term as president, he actually does end up successfully negotiating the release of the hostages in his very last day in office as president.